Okay, so as we discussed, Alex, I'm going to do a section of doing business in Brazil, and I'm going to focus today on key exports within the Brazilian economy, as well as products and sectors that focus on domestic use.
Okay.
All right, the first slide, this is a little bit of background that I'll use throughout the presentation. Basically, it's a map of Brazil regions. There's 5 regions, and then there's some ecosystems that are important to those different regions. The first region that I want to discuss is the northern region, and that's basically where the Amazon's found. And there are a lot of raw materials and commodities that come out of the Amazon. But just remember that that's in the northern part of Brazil. And to the east, we have what's called the northeastern region, and that region basically it's very dry, but there are some moister areas to the west. It's called the Cerrado. It's a high savanna, and it butts up against the Amazon region, which is obviously very wet. Now, if you go south, you've got the main economic area, and that's the states of Minas Gerais, Sao Paulo, Rio, and Espírito Santo. And this is where you've got Sao Paulo, the city, Rio de Janeiro, and another big city called Belo Horizonte. And it's really an economic triangle. But the climate there is very conducive to all kinds of products being produced, agricultural products, and there's a lot of natural vegetation that's good for exporting as well. If you go to the south, you've got the southern region, and that butts up against Argentina and Paraguay and Uruguay. There's a lot of agriculture there. It's a very developed, older economic part of Brazil. And then in the middle, you have the Mato Grosso, and it's really the breadbasket of Brazil. And I'll talk much more about that when I cover agriculture as a major export here in Brazil. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a snapshot of Brazil's important sectors and the products within those sectors. But I want to give you a little bit of background history of the economy here in Brazil. So in the earlier years, basically Brazil, it was strictly commodity based versus value added. In the very beginning, all the way back in 1500, you had Brazil wood. And when the Portuguese arrived, they needed some sort of product to export. And the Portuguese taxed that product at 20%. So really, they were just interested in exporting it to Europe. And the product was Brazil wood. That's how it got its name. And they exported that for about 50 years. And basically, in 50 years, they depleted the Atlantic rainforest. We call it the Mata Atlântica by over 90%. And this Brazil wood, it was used for red paint and dyes. But when they had depleted the Brazil wood, they realized they needed another commodity to export. And around the world, sugar was becoming much more popular and used, especially by the Europeans. So they started to plant sugar cane, in the Northeast. And this really lasted from 1550 all the way up to 1850 and the end of slavery, abolition. And what they used sugar for was obviously for flavoring and as a preservative. And then more recently, it's been used as a fuel. But I'll talk more about that later. Another important export in the earlier years that kind of replaced sugarcane was gold and mining. And they found this in Minas Gerais. I said there's Minas Gerais, Sao Paulo, and Rio, the economic centers of Brazil. And they discovered that in the mid-17th century, and really all the way to the present, they're still mining heavily in that area. But they used it for currencies, decorative purposes, and currently it's for a lot of electronics. The next one, and this is what drove sugar and gold and mining. It wasn't an export, but it's what really drove the commodity-based export economy, is slavery. And that was found mostly in the northeast of Brazil, in the sugarcane fields, then in Minas Gerais with the gold and mining, and then later in Rio and Sao Paulo. And basically slavery was found to a certain extent in all parts of Brazil. But it took place from 1550 all the way up to abolition. And it was really the inexpensive labor that helped drive growth in Brazil. Any questions so far, Alex?
The wood that you were talking about, the Brazil wood, that's nothing to do with the wood in the Amazon, the cutting down of the trees in the Amazon.
No, it's actually the Atlantic rainforest is a separate rainforest from the Amazon. So they do have Brazil nuts, and maybe you've heard of Brazil nuts, and they are in the Amazon, but they don't really log those. The logging mostly occurred along all the way from north and south on the Atlantic coast.
Okay.
So continuing with the early years, and this is even in the present day, we have some additional exports, and then a lot of domestic use. This is when they started to consume more of what they were producing and manufacturing. So the first one is cotton, and cotton likes a drier climate. And in northeast Brazil, it's very dry. So there was high production in the northeast, and then later they started to produce it in the south. But there it's a moister, colder climate. Basically, they were producing the cotton in the north and then shipping it to the south where it was manufactured into textiles. And even to this day, this is an industry that's very strong, and the exporting associated with it is also very strong. Tobacco was also a strong commodity. It's not as strong now, but it was mostly in the northeast and in some parts of the southeast and central parts of Brazil, Sao Paulo, for example. But basically, it was used more for cigars because it's a thicker blend. It's a thicker grade of cigars. But they use it for cigars, and then they blended it into tobacco for cigarettes. The next one, rubber. A lot of people have heard that Brazil was a big rubber exporter. And basically, in the Amazon, in the late 1800s and early 19th century, we developed the car, the automobile. And they needed tires for those cars. So Ford, for example, came down to Brazil and started something called Fordlandia. And this is where they tried to produce rubber trees in a monoculture way instead of going into the forest and tapping and vulcanizing. But they had some success with the monoculture, but mostly they were taking it naturally out of the forest with the indigenous people there. The next one is coffee, and coffee is mainly found in the Sao Paulo region, but it is in other parts of Brazil. And it's basically, as we know, it's used for a stimulant. But it is a huge export. It was then, and it is now. Brazil is the largest exporter of coffee in the world. A final one is cacao, and that's used for chocolate. And basically, cacao, it grows in an area in southern Bahia. And there's only one other place in the world where it really grows, and that's in the Ivory Coast. And those two markets really compete with each other. Any questions on that slide, Alex?
Oh, I see. You're going to carry on. Okay, I've just seen the next slide. I was
Yeah.
going to ask you something about beef.
I can go back.
I can see it's coming.
Yeah, beef is
No,
coming.
no,
Beef is coming.
I'm jumping ahead of you.
No problem. No problem. So those were just commodity-based exports. There was no value add. Basically, the Portuguese took those products and charged a 20% tax and then shipped them to places in Europe where then then value was added to them and they were exported to other places in the world. But here, Brazil started to realize we need to have some products that give us value add as they developed. The first one was oil and natural gas. Now, it's really been growing since the 1950s, but it came about as an important export product in the early 19th century. And they discovered reserves in the Amazon, Espírito Santos, even Bahia, around the Bay of All Saints. And then currently in Rio, where they're having the Rio boom, they've discovered the biggest reserve found in the last 30 years off the coast of Rio. Another export that's very important that has value add is electricity, hydroelectricity. 85% of the electricity for domestic or residential and commercial use is developed by hydroelectricity. Huge, massive dams as well as smaller dams in local areas. And any of the excess electricity they have, they're shipping it, they're selling it to places like Argentina, Chile, Peru, the neighboring countries in South America. They wire it there, they transmit it there, and they sell it on the open market. Other forms of energy, ethanol. They're one of the biggest producers of ethanol in the world, and they export a lot of it. A lot of it goes to the United States and Europe as well. They do have some nuclear, but it's only 2 nuclear plants, and they are in the Rio area. And then they're developing all kinds of other biofuels based on soybean, biomass, degradable biomass, etc. And then they also are involved in some wind and some solar. But this is probably their strongest area in terms of energy and exports related to oil and natural gas. Petrochemicals. Back in the 60s, the military dictatorship decided that they needed to focus on refineries and petrochemicals. So in the areas of Sao Paulo, Rio, and here in the Northeast, we have a plant called Camaçari, a company called Braskem. They started developing all kinds of petrochemical products that could be used as plastics and also ethanol for fuel. They're very strong players in the world market in the petrochemical export area. They're still mining, but now they're mining more than just gold and diamonds. They're the biggest exporter of iron ore in the world, and they're exporting that to the United States and to China. Mainly to China because China is growing at 7.5% and they need steel. So iron ore is the raw material for steel. They're also exporting copper and nickel, and that's used for a lot of electronics, cell phones, computers, smaller electronic parts. And they're a huge exporter of fertilizers as well as a domestic consumer, and the fertilizers are used for agriculture. They have huge potassium chloride and phosphate deposits in Brazil, and they use those for the fertilizers. The final one, and this is a huge part of their economy, is agriculture. Brazil is the second largest exporter of corn in the world. They're the largest exporter of soybean. They are the largest exporter of frozen orange juice. And they are the largest exporter of beef and frozen chicken. Now these are huge areas of export, and China is the main consumer of these, but the United States is also a major consumer of the chicken and the beef. Any questions on any of the slides so far, Alex?
No, it's very interesting. Looking forward to seeing whether you're going to say anything about their how they get everything out, the logistics. Because to be the biggest exporter, you need a lot of ships, right?
Well, and that is the last slide, which is called conclusions, addresses that point.
Okay.
I do not get into that, but that is a whole nother section, developing the infrastructure and the logistics, which is where a lot of the money in the next 20 to 30 years is going to go. This section mostly focuses on the sectors, but at the end it asks the question, well, how are they going to export these products more? So that's a great question. In this area, I don't cover it, but it's a whole section in itself. All right. Would you like me to continue?
No, this has given me a really nice little snapshot, Matt.
Okay.
And I'm really excited to hear the rest.
Good. Yeah, it's an hour and a half course. It could go 2 hours if we have lots of questions, but yeah, I will cover all those questions that you had and more in this presentation.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Alex, and you have a very nice day.